Matthew Titcomb. Or not Matthew Titcomb. What the world? Matthew Travis. I just had on Matthew Titcomb. That's why he's on my mind. That bugger. I don't know if you've had any extensive conversations with him.
Just a few.
He's a funny guy. He is a funny guy. I had him and Jim Gopal on, and it was a hoot. it was a violent hoot. But again, Matthew Travis, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you. I know that you're a busy guy. So thanks for coming on.
No, Steven, good to be with you. Appreciate the invitation.
When we were scheduling this, we were having the conversation with your team. I would never have assumed that literally like an hour after we got off the phone, we would be having a totally different frame of mind with the suspension of phase 2. That was very timely, I guess. Your
timing was impeccable. I think it was about an hour after we got the phone and started getting some rumblings that something was afoot. Did not anticipate all that came out, but I'm sure we'll get into that today.
Well, yeah, and we will. I definitely want to dive into it. It was definitely a shock. It was one of those things that, with the 32 CFR, the proposed rule way back when, and then the final rule, that we were like on pins and needles for that. We were like, yeah, this is coming. We're ready for it. We're excited for it. And then what is this? So yeah, that was definitely a shock.
I've learned that it takes a lot of time and effort for the government to impose regulations on industry, and clearly it does not take nearly as long or as much effort to pull them back. And I think that was the stark lesson immediately that we learned, because you're right, for 3 years, we were kind of watching and waiting for this process to play out. It did. It was codified in the Code of Federal Regulations.
Yeah.
And with one stroke of the pen in the Pentagon, we're kind of back into an orbit of program review. So there we are.
Yeah, I definitely want to touch on it more. And you're definitely the guy to talk on about it with, because there is a lot going on in the ecosystem talking about that. I've tried to put out a couple helpful posts about it, but and there's a lot of really good posts out there, talking heads that are helping the community, but there is a lot of rumblings about it. So yeah, let's dive into that. Well, again, Matt, thank you for coming on. And I really want, I say this pretty much every episode, that I have a heart for polemical tensions being lightened in this industry. And I think one of the ways to do that is to get people to know the faces that they commonly see, that they may say polemical things because they may have to, right? You may have somebody saying making totally absurd claims, and you have to kind of push back against it for the sake of common good. But I really want people to get to trust the people who are really trying to help this, and who, as one of the leading, personnel in this industry, trying to help this industry get more in line with the ultimate goal to protect the warfighter and our information. I think you were one of the ones that I really wanted to touch on. So if you're okay with it, I'd like to just let people get to know your background, how and where you grew up, family life, hobbies, like any, as far back as you're willing to go, and up to today, what made you the person that you are today, doing the things that you do today?
Sure. Well, I'm a proud, proudly from a town in Indiana called Terre Haute, which is in the southwest central part of the state of Indiana. And while I was born, my parents were from Brooklyn, New York. I was born in Brooklyn. We moved out there when I was like 2 or 3. My father was a chemist for Pfizer, and so they had a penicillin plant out there in Indiana, and so we all moved out there. And I had a great Midwestern, safe, fun upbringing. I sometimes shudder to think if I had grown up on the streets of Brooklyn, New York, I'd probably have a different accent and maybe a different worldview. But it was central Indiana was a wonderful place to grow up. And like most kids, I played sports, I swam. I had a paper out as a young boy, so I actually had a job, which means I had more money than my friends. So I had the most, and I'm dating myself, Atari cartridges, and then eventually a Commodore 64 that I played around with. So I had the most Commodore 64 games. And so yeah, really just a nice upbringing, and had a younger brother, older sister, and the five of us had a great time in Terre Haute, Indiana. One side note for any sports fans who are watching this, Terre Haute is where Indiana State University is. And when I was growing up, that's when Larry Bird left Indiana University and took a year off and went then enrolled at Indiana State. So I had a front row seat. My dad got season tickets to all of Larry Bird's college games.
Wow.
And then I got to know him because my best friend's father was his academic counselor at Indiana State University. And Bird, to get out of the limelight on campus, would go over to their house down the street, and I would play driveway basketball against Larry Bird and wiffle ball. And he's an All-American. The funny thing, too, so he's an All-American. I'm a 10-year-old. And he would literally block your shot and then dunk it. Block your shot. He had no mercy for a 10-year-old kid playing driveway basketball. No. But that was a real thrill to see what he did for that team. Then obviously go on to the Boston Celtics. And so following him was just a big part of my childhood.
That is insane.
Yeah.
I know that like my father-in-law has talked about Larry Bird. I'm a youngin. Okay. So, there's, and I was never really a huge sports fan. So at least never a huge like basketball sports fan until more recently. So like the old names, MJ and, Larry Bird and all those guys, I've only heard from a distance, so that's really cool to hear. That's really interesting.
There's still great highlight reels on Twitter, on X. So you can see some of his, highlights in the NBA, and they're still pretty popular. So
yeah. Some of those old players, I have seen some of the clips, and it's just like, man, what would they do today with all the changes in the rules and the changes in the game and dealing with the attitudes and the dispositions of just the general population? How would they have fared in our modern basketball era? Yeah.
Well, now with more spread out offense and shooters like Curry and others, I think Bird would have fared pretty well because it's a more spread out game. He can't hand check as much. There's not so much physicality in the fouling. So I think he and others would have done just fine today.
Yeah. Are you still pretty an adamant sports guy? You like watching sports and stuff?
I am, yeah. I don't have as much time as I used to, but college football, again, I'm a season ticket holder for the New York Giants because when my father was growing up in New York City, he was a bartender to make money. And, back then it was boxing and horse racing and baseball were the popular sports. Yeah. But he saw the New York Giants play football in the 1950s, and he thought, this is a great sport. And so he went out and bought season tickets for him and his two brothers. And that was like 60 years ago. And so now I've got the season ticket. So I don't get up to, New York is often here in the DC area, but I've got cousins up there that I'll give tickets to. So I follow the Giants. I went to college at Notre Dame. So obviously Saturdays in the fall, I'm glued to what the Fighting Irish are doing. But with two kids, I don't have as much time to watch sports. I'm generally watching them play sports on weekends.
How old are your kids, if you don't mind me asking?
Daughter is 15 and son is 13. So they're right there in the middle school, high school era. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a busy life. I mean, I'm not there yet, right? All my kids are 5 under 5 essentially. So but I'm anticipating the days.
Dealing with 2 is a handful. I don't know how you're going to fare with the small army you've got there, Stephen.
Yeah, my wife just had twins a couple months ago. They're back in May, and obviously we never had twins before. And I will say, taking care of twins in the evenings with feedings and everything is more than double the work. I don't care what anybody said. It's more when you only have, you don't have any extra hands, right? When they're both screaming at you, it gets kind of violent, I guess. Them towards me, of course.
Sure. Clearly, yeah.
I gotta make that disclaimer. And you said earlier you don't have a lot of time. I can't imagine why, Matt. I can't imagine why. What in the world?
Well, it's gotten better. We're adding staff here at the Cyber AB, and so for a long time though, it was just me and the small team that you've probably interacted with at some point. But CMC is busy for all of us, right? It's still an evolving program, obviously, and that certainly keeps me occupied.
Yeah. So tell me about your professional background. Like, I mean, obviously, your education and everything like that would probably play into that. And I don't think we've mentioned that yet, but maybe start with your education, where
Sure.
and what led you into some of the roles that you have today, and maybe we'll dive into deeper into some of them.
Yeah, as a high school student, I was very lightly recruited for football, and so I recognized that was never going to be. I was never going to be a Division I football player, so I gave up any aspirations. But I got to make some recruiting trips here and there. But ultimately, I got a Navy ROTC scholarship, and I was able to use that at Notre Dame, which is in the northern part of the state of Indiana. But I've been up there once or twice and really kind of just became enamored with the entire university and its mission. And so I was a student at Notre Dame as an ROTC. You're essentially playing Navy part-time. I have friends who went to Naval Academy, and you are living Navy every day, 24 hours a day. ROTC, you could be a normal college student, but still, a couple days a week, you would put on the uniform and you were in the Navy. And of course, in the summers, we get to go out with the fleet. And so after graduation and commissioning, they sent me to Newport, Rhode Island for a year of Naval Engineering School, Naval Communications School. And then after a year in Newport, which is, the great thing about the Navy too, Stephen, is pretty much no matter where you are, it's a nice place. Newport, Rhode Island, Annapolis, Charleston, Key West, Pearl Harbor, Seattle, San Diego, where friends in the Army are like, stuck in the middle of, well, I don't want to disparage any Army bases or states, but we got some nice spots in the Navy. So the year at Newport, and then my ship was out of Charleston, South Carolina. It was a guided missile frigate, the USS Carr, named after Paul Henry Carr, who was a sailor on the USS Samuel B. Roberts during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and he did some heroic things, and so he perished in that battle, but got a ship named after him.
Honored him. Yeah,
a frigate is designed to be a submarine hunter, but this was just as I reached the fleet. It was the Berlin Wall had fallen down. The Soviet Navy really kind of pulled back and was not really the blue water force that it had been, and so there really weren't as many submarines to chase. And so this is again the early 90s, we did counter narcotics operations. So we would, we'd tool around in the Caribbean looking for drug runners. We did deploy to the Middle East and did a full 6-month deployment in the Northern Red Sea, where we enforced UN sanctions against Iraq. So this is after the first Gulf War. And I was an interdiction officer. I was an engineer in a normal job, but for this mission, I was a boarding officer. So I got a 9mm Beretta and a team of folks, and we would intercept big cargo container ships, and we would board them up a rope ladder, and I'd go up to the bridge with the captain and tell them we were here to inspect them. And we had a UN resolution that allowed us to do this. And then my team would go down in the cargo holds and break open all the big containers. So it's very surprising all that is traded on the high seas. It was quite an interesting thing to be doing.
That sounds like they could have made a movie out of that. Did you ever tell the captain that you're the captain now?
That came later, but there were some. Again, it was an eye-opening experience not knowing all that maritime commerce. Right? You don't think about it. People think, well, planes just bring all this stuff from other countries. No, it goes by ship. And whether it's including like livestock, right? So we board sheep ships because they eat a lot of lamb in that part of the world, and so I'd be crawling over sheep during mating season. We were car containers from Japan, and so I never wanted to ask, but I fear that some of my crew members would be getting in these BMWs and these huge car containers and test driving the cars while they're supposed to be inspecting them. So it was an adventure. They didn't make a movie, but we had a couple of news crews come out, and they would call us Raiders of the Red Sea. So it wasn't a full-length movie, but a couple of news features while I was doing that. And it's just great learning experience and just being out there. We were right off the tip of Mount Sinai, as where the choke point was, and then finished that and kind of toured the rest of the Mediterranean, came home. And after that, I found myself. The question is, why did you ever get out of the Navy? Because I stayed in a bit longer. I took a job because after my tour on the ship was over, it's like, okay, what are you going to do next? And I was going to get out then, but they offered me a job up here in Washington, which is how I eventually got in the National Capital Region. And I was the White House liaison to the Secretary of the Navy. And that was a job I couldn't pass down. So it was really the point person. So any Navy issues that the White House would deal with, I would be the one working those cases between the Secretary of the Navy and the White House. But I was also, at the time, a collateral duty. I was one of the White House military aides. Now, not the aide that carries the nuclear codes. That's the presidential aide. There's one of those from the Navy, one from the Army, and they all rotate. But then there's a bigger cadre of military officers from the services who are called social aides. And part of the rationale there is that when the president and the first lady are hosting events, there's only two of them. And whether it's a bill signing, if it's a state dinner, if it's a holiday party, a movie premiere, whatever, they've got hundreds of guests coming. And so they need help, hosting events, doing the receiving line, mingling with people. So that was in President Clinton's second term is when I did that. And it was just such a fascinating side hustle to do when I was in the Navy. Now, one of the criteria, Stephen, is that you had to be single. And this goes back decades because one of the jobs was where appropriate, you would have to dance. And they didn't want the scandal of a married naval officer dancing with, married women in the White House. So I think that's still a requirement
ironic,
that you have to be single. Yeah. So
that's a little ironic in the Clinton administration.
Well, I won't comment on that, but you had to pass an interview with etiquette questions and all that. And then they even gave us waltzing lessons. I took waltzing lessons in the main foyer of the White House. So that was, and we would do the receiving lines.
And show us a little bit right now.
That was a long time ago. And that was not my strong suit. I was good at small talk. But, this is pre 9/11. It's a Clinton administration. There are tons of movie stars, athletes, folks coming in. I got to meet Bruce Springsteen, Brett Favre, John Bon Jovi, Peter, just a lot of famous people. And when folks are in the White House, it's the one place where they're actually intimidated, because normally out in public, they're celebrities, but in the White House, so they're looking for someone to talk to, and we have to know all the paintings and all the furniture, and so you'd be just striking up conversations with folks about, what happened in this room and that room, and it was also when all the Monica Lewinsky drama was going on, so that was a crazy time to be in the White House. So long-winded answer to your question. After that was over, then I realized it would be time to go back out to sea, and any naval officer with his or her salt would rather be out at sea than inside the Beltway in Washington. And I was like, I kind of like it here. This has been kind of interesting being in DC. And also, I say half jokingly, I used to get seasick. And so being in the Navy wasn't probably a good long-term career plan anyway. So it was a convenient time to punch out. So I did 7 total years in the Navy, got out there. But I always look back at that experience, learned so much, and wouldn't trade those years for the world.
Wow. So that your time in the White House, you met the president, I'm assuming, right? You got to converse with him,
Yeah.
What was that like? And you see clips of different presidents, especially previous presidents. Obviously you see a lot more of Trump and whatnot in the news and whatnot today, but what was it like talking to him? And was he aggressive? Was he nice? Was he what was that like dealing with the Clinton administration?
Yeah, he was great. He was so, I know again, without getting political, a lot of the critics of President Clinton, Slick Willie and all the kind of derogatory nicknames. He was as authentic and natural as a political figure, a true politician that I've seen. He drew energy from interacting with other people. And I'm not going to psychoanalyze whether he had a dysfunctional childhood, what led to that. But there were times when, a lot of times there'd be groups coming in to do an event on the South Lawn or the Rose Garden. It could be the Boy Scouts. It could be a sports team. It could be whatever. And I remember more than one occasion, generally, the First Lady had a social office, and they were usually ones planning these events. And the military aides would just be there as part of the team. And oftentimes the president, if it was going to be down in the diplomatic reception room, which is in the lower level of the White House, or outside, he'd do a little prep session. Mr. President, you're going to go out so-and-so, you're going to shake so-and-so's hand, then they're going to play some music, and then you're going to give your speech. Here's your speech, all that kind of stuff. And more than one occasion, he'd come down in a foul mood. I mean, he had a temper. As friendly as President Clinton was and is, he had a sailor's mouth at times, and he was angry. But so he'd come down and he was not in a good mood. But once he went out and started meeting with his fellow citizens, he drew energy. He would just lighten up. And it was just, and he was so good about remembering people. And when he was talking to you, you know, plenty of times at the White House, Stephen, you'd be at a party or something, and whether he's senator or someone, they'd be talking to you, like, oh, Stephen, oh, so you work for Intelligence University, that's great. And meanwhile, they're looking for someone else to talk to, you know, like, oh, you got 5 kids, good for you. Like,
Yeah.
But when President Clinton would talk to you, he would be locking in. He's like, oh, Stephen, you're from so-and-so, that's great. What, you know, all that. And he remember folks, I know someone from your hometown. And it was just a great lesson in this. He was just a tremendous political athlete, for lack of a better term.
Right. Yeah.
And great political skills. So,
it
was. I didn't. Obviously, we were the help. You know, I wasn't. We were just there to support him and the first lady. But he was very friendly.
That's really cool. Yeah, you don't really hear that side of it. I will say I have never heard anything positive about Bill Clinton other than the financial surplus we had during his administration. That was it. So it's actually really cool to hear like a perspective of somebody who like kind of semi knew him and interacted with him, seeing that he was genuine. And I can imagine being a stressed out. I mean, you see like the images of like the before and after with like President Barack Obama going in, and then after his hair's all gray and he's all stressed out. And like, I can imagine, I mean, just the weight of the world being on your shoulders, being a relatively grumpy person. But it is cool to hear that, like, you know, because I'm that way. I'm an extrovert. So like I feed off of, you know, having conversation and spending time with people. That's what makes me happy and what I enjoy. So but I can imagine being such a stressed out person and then just livening up when you're with people. That's really cool.
Well, and two, I mentioned this was his second term. So once the Monica Lewinsky stuff came to the fore, that was even more stress on, you know, he was the special counsel, he was doing his investigation. There were some tense moments there. But it was just felt very lucky to have that experience kind of as a fly on the wall and being able to observe all that, meet world leaders at state dinners and all that, and look back with great fondness in those years.
Yeah, it gives you context, right? It gives you context into the person, and where pretty much everything you see on the media or whatever from people that you've talked to is negative. But then you have maybe a little bit more empathetic of a view of the person, right? Because you actually interact with them. That's one reason why, like, I like doing this podcast, is because like there's so much polemics, and we'll get to this in a minute, but like there's so much polemics, there's so much negativity, and like criticism is like probably part of your day to day, right? And like
recently,
but if people like knew you, you know, like, you know, if people like came into contact, heard your story and heard your background, same thing with like the president, like, we're human beings, we're broken, we need some grace. You know, give us some grace.
Absolutely. I'm always interested to learn about other people's background too. It's just interesting to learn where other people, what they've done and what they've encountered. So you can always learn from listening to others. Yeah.
Okay. So military, you decided that you actually enjoyed kind of the 95 corridor mentality and lifestyle. And so you left the Navy, right? And what was the next stop in your journey?
Yeah. So one of the last things I did the last year I was in the Navy, I got detailed to a team to go to Bosnia to oversee the elections. And this is after the Bosnian War ended in 95. And there's a group called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. It's an international organization, kind of sits next to NATO as this kind of the civilian counterpart to NATO to ensure European harmony and cooperation and all of that. And so I was in grad school at Georgetown at the time. I was in the Navy. I was going to night classes in national security, and so I kind of got involved with some of the folks involved in the State Department, and they was essentially detailed to the State Department to go over and to be a part of the team that observed the legitimacy of the Bosnian elections. And I really enjoyed that. And so I thought, well, maybe I got in the Navy, I should go be a diplomat. So I took the Foreign Service exam and passed it. And so the next thing I knew, I was on my way to becoming a State Department Foreign Service officer. But I needed so I left the Navy, and I needed something to do to pay the rent. And I had entered law school also at night, because I thought, well, if this thing with the State Department doesn't work out, I'll at least have a law degree, because I thought it was going to be a while before the State Department training would kick in. And actually, as I think back about it, I started law school and then found out about I'd passed all the exams. So I left law school without ever taking a class, then I needed or ever taking a test. So essentially, I was waiting for the State Department to start, needed to pay the rent, and took a job with a small consulting firm in downtown Washington that did like defense analyses. And had been in the Navy, I knew that there were a lot of defense contractors, but I thought they all just did, IT work. I didn't know you could actually do analyses. What's Iran going to look like in 25 years? One of the projects was, how to fix peacekeeping in Bosnia. I'd been to Bosnia, so I was working, did some work with a lot of the three-letter agencies. And my eyes opened. I was like, wow, this is kind of interesting. I could do interesting national security type projects from a nice office downtown and make money doing it.
Right.
So I didn't realize how much the government outsources to industry. We obviously learned that in CMMC. But even those type of analytical roles where you're doing research and analyses, kind of like a for-profit think tank is what it was. And then by the time the State Department called and said, okay, we're ready for you, I'd learned a lot about business. I was having fun. I was really enjoying the project work I was doing. And kind of a seminal moment, I was back over in Bosnia now trying to figure out how to, part of a project for the Pentagon, and how to fix peacekeeping in Bosnia. There was just a lot of problems with the international peacekeeping force that was there in the former Yugoslavia, Croatia, Bosnia, eventually Kosovo. And I remember the day where I made the decision, because the State Department kept asking, hey, when are you coming? You could defer for like a year, but then it was like, okay, you're coming now or never. Right. And I had to go take a trip back to Sarajevo, and I had a meeting with the U.S. ambassador to Bosnia to interview him about how to fix this peacekeeping problem. And I remember I showed up as this cold, kind of rainy day in Sarajevo, which is a gorgeous city. I show up at the U.S. Embassy. A guy my age gets me through security, gets me a badge, takes my coat, gets me a cup of coffee, walks me all the way up to the ambassador's office, upon which time he goes back to his windowless cubicle in the basement. And I spent 90 minutes with the ambassador. And he was a junior foreign service officer. And I was like, I don't mind. I had no problem paying dues, but I'm like, I can go be that guy, or I could just kind of keep doing from a private sector capacity. And so I said no to the State Department and stayed on with that company. Eventually, that became acquired by a British firm. That made me the president of that. And then that got acquired by BAE Systems. And I moved on from there and started my own company. And that's where I was doing for about 15 years. When I left the Navy, I was in security consulting, and that's eventually what got me into cybersecurity.
Wow. Wait. So this analysis firm that you were working at, that kind of just changed your mind in total about, because you didn't know before, obviously, about how much was outsourced, not just IT or maybe manufacturing, but like even just from rough statistics and financial audits. Like we've done work with companies that are like some of the biggest financial auditing firms that do audits for the government. That's why they have a CMMC requirement, is because financial data that's categorized as CUI, but part of a DoD contract. That's interesting. So what led you to? I mean, what led you to not want to do all the super cool spy stuff, the stuff that you kind of had been doing, not spy stuff, but
so it was
active stuff.
I was surprised, right? So it was I was finishing up at Georgetown. A professor there referred me because she knew I was graduating and getting out of the Navy, and even though I just started law school, she was like, well, you should go talk to this firm right on DuPont Circle, which is as you know, downtown here. And I was just surprised. I didn't know the Pentagon, the intelligence community, would outsource these types of projects. Now it's a small, when you think about all the GovCon landscape, this is a very small, but it's kind of up pretty high there in terms of the value chain, in terms of interest and impact. So it was a very niche boutique consulting firm that did just a lot of interesting work in Africa. Looking at demographic data, doing some stuff I won't talk about that's on the classified side, but I was doing interesting, intellectually satisfying work. I was learning business, and I was making more money than I'd make in the government. And so it was, to me, it was like, let's see where this goes. And then it just followed that, and then that led to me eventually starting my own company in the same field.
Well, when the British firm bought out your company and they made you the president, what was not because of obviously competence is there, but what was the reason why you over someone else becoming the president there?
So this is where serendipity, not for the nation, but just for in your career timing. So what really changed everything was unfortunately 9/11, and that created a whole new business of Homeland Security and Homeland Defense. We'd been doing, or I'd been doing, I led some teams looking at the concept of Homeland Defense for the Pentagon. They had, because they could see, there were some commissions that had looked at reorganizing government to better protect against the growing threat of terrorism and other things. And so by the time, so 9/11 happens, and now you have a new department. And that was like, before, when you're in the defense market, you've got all these big pachyderms, that are trundling along the jungle, the SEICs and the Lockheed Martin, right? And so when you're a small business, you're just trying to get the crumbs, the stuff, the food that they're eating.
Yeah.
But here now you have a whole new mission area, Homeland Security. It was kind of, lack of a better term, green fields. And so it was open season for good ideas. And so we were able to get some initial work from initially the Office of Homeland Security Office within the White House, and then when they started the department up. And because I had this growing portfolio of Homeland Security that was new, I think the Brits said, well, let's go with this guy because this is where the growth seems to be.
Yeah, he's got the most ties. Yeah, that makes sense.
And
so as president, what did your day-to-day look like? I mean, is it similar to what you're doing now, like more administration stuff, or did you get to continue doing what you love?
It becomes more when you're chief executive, especially the British company that bought us was publicly traded on the London Stock Exchange, and so now you're into a whole new world of quarterly reporting numbers. I was no longer doing project work. I was answering to my new bosses in London, going to London all the time, but also just trying to get as much revenue out of the various parts of the company as I could. It's a necessary evil, and that when you're in that kind of company, but it kind of turned me off to working in that part of the industry just because of that. I really do enjoy the content of helping the government figure things out, solving problems. And so when that company then got acquired by BAE Systems, it was a natural point in time. They were looking for someone else with more star power to run that. Right. Good time for me to punch out. I left then, and that's when I co-founded my own company.
What was the name of your company?
Obsidian Analysis. And we were located right downtown, and we really tried to, I'd say FEMA was our biggest client, among other parts of the DHS. We had some DoD work, private sector work for energy companies, and we did a lot of exercise design, right? So you're doing simulation, building simulation games, actually facilitating exercises. And probably the break we got was every year Congress mandate, or every other year, what's called the national level exercise. And this came out of really 2000, after the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a concern about all these loose nukes. The Congress said to then the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Pentagon, you need to do exercise with state and local officials to prepare for loose nukes, bioweapons, just bad things happening from all these Russian scientists that could be scattering to bad countries. And it really started a whole exercise industrial complex, lack of a term. All of a sudden, there was a lot of demand for designing and conducting exercises, both live exercises, simulated tabletops. And so our company had a foothold in that. And so we did a lot of that for FEMA.
Like the schools and stuff like that too? Is that where a lot of the school exercises for, if nuclear bombs were warning and things like that, like that you see in movies and stuff like that? Is that where
absolutely. You get at every different level, right? There are national exercises, and there are regional, state, local, and even municipalities will have the need to exercise their plans, because in essence, with all the threats, states, cities, government agencies need plans, right? And what's the best way to see if this plan works is to try to run it through some scenarios. And so we did a lot, but the breakthrough to cyber was in 2011. It was the first time the government said this national exercise that we have to do every 2 years as mandated by Congress, is going to be a cyber exercise. And they just decided to tag that contract as a small business set aside. Now, and we were still a small business. And so we won that contract to plan and conduct the 2011 national level exercise, which was a cyber scenario, which is a big deal. It takes like a year to plan. It's a lot of money. And that's really what got me into cybersecurity. Was I was the lead for that whole effort of planning the national level exercise that occurred in May of 2012. Yeah.
Had you had background in IT or cybersecurity up to that point, or was this like your jump off point? You had to like cram all this knowledge so that you could do it well.
I had some IT background in the Navy, and I learned a few things on my old Commodore 64, but I didn't really stay with it. I wasn't a computer science major or anything like that. But a lot of it were concepts and understanding roles and responsibilities, understanding different threat vectors. So I could talk my way through it, but once you're kind of in the door, you've got the credential, then people hire you to do more cybersecurity work. And so we started working for energy companies to plan their cyber disruption exercise, or help them develop their cybersecurity plans. And it kind of went from there.
So what happened to Obsidian? You said Obsidian Analytics, was that?
Obsidian Analysis. So we had stood that up. We had been going for 6 years and going great, growing. We had about 150 people, and then at some point, other companies take notice, and either to get us off the market or to accelerate their own numbers, we got acquired. I mean, we agreed to it. It was a nice problem to have, and so. We sold the company to a company store actually called Cadmus, and they started in the kind of environmental energy sectors and wanted to get into national security. And so we became part of Cadmus, and I helped with that transition for 2 years before I was asked to go into government myself. So that was, and Cadmus is still operating today.
Okay, so it's still operating today. Do they still do similar things to what you had kind of?
They do. Yeah. It's a tougher environment for contractors these days. The last couple of years. So, but yeah, they're still doing good stuff.
Yeah, that's cool. It's cool to like see heritage. It's cool to see things that you kind of built out and see it last. That's really neat.
Absolutely.
So from Obsidian, where did you end up going?
I went into DHS. And so the story behind that, people always ask me, like, oh, how did you get appointed in government? I wasn't politically active. I'm a Republican, but kind of a Dick Lugar, Dan Quayle type of Indiana Republican. So, but what happened was, throughout my career, Steve, and I'm sure this way too, I'm always happy to talk to folks or meet with them. I'm not very good with email, but if someone wants to meet for coffee or something, I love to talk to people. And there was a point in time when I think it was even before Obsidian, a woman who was leaving government and knew my wife a bit, was looking for some advice on what is the government consulting world like. And so I bought her coffee and spent an hour with her and talked to her about it. 10 years later, she found herself on the Trump transition team trying to staff the new government, because when President Trump was elected, there wasn't a big transition plan. I think the story goes that Chris Christie had a binder of here are all the people that we should bring into government, and that was tossed aside and they started over. So she was frantically trying. She knew I worked with DHS as a client, and so she was asking names of folks I thought would be good. I gave her Chris Krebs' name. I gave her other names, and then she said, "What about you?" And I said, "Well, I just sold my company. I'm fine." But eventually, they kept calling, and there was an opportunity to go in. Initially,
you can't refuse.
Well, it wasn't that. There was a couple of jobs I had in mind, and if you recall, it was General Kelly was the first secretary of DHS. And I went in to interview with him, ostensibly either to be chief of staff or to go in. CISA didn't exist then. It was called NPPD, the National Protection and Programs Directorate. And what is now CISA was in there, as well as a bunch of other things. And then I interviewed him, and he's like, "I want you to come in." Great. And then next day I turned on the news a couple of days later, and he was going to the White House to be the White House chief of staff. So then I came back in to interview with the acting secretary, Elaine Duke. And then before I knew it, she was no longer the acting secretary. So eventually, when Secretary Nielsen got there, they asked me to come in, and I was happy to, as initially the deputy undersecretary of NPPD. And then a year into that is when the Congress passed essentially the CISA Act that created the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And so automatically I flipped from being the deputy undersecretary to being the deputy director of CISA.
Was that part of the initial plan of that act, was for that infrastructure to just convert over, like kind of how like US CERT converted over? Like, was that part of all of that in the beginning?
It was, and US CERT was really what started it. And before, I think the predecessor to US CERT was actually GSA. If you look back to where government cybersecurity actually started,
Yeah.
There was like a small office in GSA called, I think, FedCert. Its job was to make sure like the computers worked within all the other, government agencies. And this is before security was really a thing. It was more just making sure like the IT was being coordinated.
Yeah.
And then eventually US CERT, Carnegie Mellon, and then into DHS. So the issue was that cyber was buried under this part of DHS. Initially, when the department was created after 9/11, it was the fear that the terrorists, conventional counterterrorism, were going to attack infrastructure, chemical plants, and bridges and dams. And so you had this Office for Infrastructure Protection. It was big, and then you had this little small cyber unit. But over time, the cyber mission got bigger. Right. The infrastructure protection mission contracted a bit, and the Congress recognized, also at the urging of those in DHS, that we as a nation need a civilian cybersecurity agency. And so the
obvious
yeah
that nation state hacking and things like that were just getting out of control. We just needed to do something. That makes sense.
At this point, you had the OPM breach, you had the Sony breach. I mean, you had so much. It took some convincing, though. Not everyone. I really credit Congressman McCall from Texas, as well as Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, who kind of got it through. And then, of course, what to call it, right? So the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency doesn't really roll off the tongue, using security twice in the same agency name. And then, of course, you have what's the initialism or acronym going to be? And so CISA begs the question, okay, well, how do you pronounce that? Now, VISA is Visa and LISA is Lisa, but somehow CISA is CISA. And it's because the story of that is that DISA or DISA already existed. And a lot of the infrastructure and the people from DISA came over to stand up what was initially NPPD and later CISA. So there's a DISA heritage into CISA. And so phonetically, it was determined that we will call it CISA, not CISA, not CISA, but CISA, even though there's only one S.
Interesting. I did not know that. So I probably pronounced it incorrectly several times. So CISA. So when you were in your deputy director role there, what was the main thing that you had to get off the ground that was like your main hurdle? Because I'm assuming there was a lot of them, especially with it being a new entity in a way.
Yeah.
What was probably the most? Because I'm assuming all of this prepared you for what you're doing now, which we're about to get to. So, what was the main thing that got you off that you had to get off the ground?
It was Chris Krebs, who used to work for me at Obsidian and left Obsidian, went to Microsoft, got his cyber chops, and then was offered the job as the undersecretary and eventually the director of CISA. So he was my boss, and he wanted me to really unify. NPPD was business school case study in siloed, dysfunctional organization, because you had
not the government.
Yeah, I know, Stephen. Imagine that. But there's also there was an emergency communications role to CISA that still exists, that goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Interestingly, if the president ever wants to turn off the internet, he goes to CISA, and the authorities to compel the telecommunication companies are go through CISA. So there's an emergency communication silo. There was the cyber silo, There was the infrastructure protection silo. There was all the chemical inspectors. There was a chemical anti-terrorism act that was passed to protect chemical plants from terrorists that had kind of like CMMC, a very heavy regulatory element to it. So you had all these disparate parts of the same organization that did not talk to each other and did not see themselves as part of this new CISA. So my first and foremost priority from Chris and from the secretary is unify the organization. And so really do change management, right? Transform. We called it CISA 2020. So we started this in 2018, and the idea was by 2020, we had unified the organization. So big reorg in terms of changing titling, integrating the budget into one unified budget, because you had all these individual budgets that all rolled up. And so that was pretty much my full-time job, in addition to all the other things you do as a deputy, kind of, keeping the trains running on time. And then COVID hit in my last year there, and the then acting secretary, Chad Wolf, brought me up to help him navigate the department through COVID. So for that last year, I had two hats on. I was still the deputy director at CISA, but I was also the head of the secretary's action group to figure out how to manage all the missions of DHS in a COVID environment. And so
if you had to guess, how many hours were you working at that point?
We didn't keep timesheets. My family reminds me how little time I was home for that, but you kind of knew that going in, right? I mean, government service is a real thing too, but it's a privilege to be able to operate at that level. And so I was very grateful, and I knew it was going to be a short stint. I wouldn't be doing this for 10 years, so I could suck it up and do those long hours. But yeah, it was pretty busy.
Just the way you described that, I was like, this man was working at least 10 to 12 hours a day. Like, at least. No way he's not.
Yeah, it was a lot.
So that sounds like it was a really impactful and insightful time at CISA as well. Coming out of COVID, I mean, that's obviously when CMMC is getting stood up, the ecosystem is getting stood up. So I'm assuming it was right from CISA into your role at the Cyber AB, is that, or CMMC AB?
I do, yeah. So I was a political appointee, and so at the end of the Trump administration, a little earlier before the very end, but essentially was back out of government. And it was really just timing, Stephen. I was aware of the CMMC program being in DHS, but I wasn't the one, following it closely. And shortly after I left CISA, became aware there was an executive search firm that the original, what is now the Cyber AB, our board had commissioned an executive search firm to go find the first CEO. So the AB was formed at the encouragement of, back then, the Pentagon leadership that wanted to launch this program. And so, but they formed literally weeks before COVID hit in like January, February of 2020 is when, it's that famous meeting, I think, when Katie Arrington was in front of the Professional Services Council and said, we're going to make, cybersecurity conformity to 800-171 be assessed by a third party. We want industry to respond, and we need some of you to form an accreditation body to kind of help us oversee all this. And so we had a bunch of volunteers, that original board of directors, and they started meeting, right before COVID. And I'm not sure they ever had an in-person meeting because COVID hit just after they kind of formed. But after operating, working with the Pentagon to kind of scope the real original parameters of CMMC 1.0, by the late winter of 2020, they had hired a search firm to find its first CEO. And so when I looked at that, I thought, okay, well, I've run a cybersecurity agency, so I know cyber now. I've been a defense contractor and a small business owner.
Yeah,
and so I can appreciate all the burdens that go with, having a government contract. And then I've also been in the Navy, and so I understand how important contractors are to carrying out the mission. I mean, we had tech reps on our ship that as an engineering auxiliary officer, I couldn't succeed without some of the civilian contractors that would helicopter out to our ship and fix stuff or troubleshoot things. And so I felt like I could help because I had a vantage point experience in all these three, government, cyber, active duty military, defense contractor, small business owner. And so I put my hat in the ring, and next thing I know, I was offered the position. And we're talking about this latest pause of requirements implementation, and then the program review that's coming up here or started. I accepted the CMMC AB, then the CEO role, and was slated to start on April 1st of 2021. And on March 30th is when the Pentagon announced, because the Biden administration was now in, and they said, okay, we see this program. We need to look at this before we continue to move forward. So they hit the pause button the first time, literally just as I started. And so my first 6 months on the job was waiting to see if there'd still be a CMMC program. And
your
there was.
job security was
right
out the gate. Am I still going to be here in 6 months?
I felt reasonable enough that, listen, when I was at CISA, Steve, I saw you get intel briefings every morning. You'd see the reporting of all the compromises and attempted compromises across all 16 sectors of infrastructure, including the DIB. And so I knew that the threat landscape wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. And the government wasn't going to stop doing contracting, so they had to do something. And I thought it was reasonable for them to, just like with FedRAMP, you have a third party assess conformity to a standard the government set. So even though it was touch and go at times, certainly whether or not they need an AB, I was confident that the Tiger team and then the executive task force under the Biden Pentagon stood up to look at this, would come to the same conclusions that I was coming to, which is this is still needed ever more so. And so by the time CMMC 2.0 was announced, obviously there was going to be some rulemaking that followed that, but I was confident that this program was on solid footing.
Before we get to the solid footing conversation, because that's a big deal here, and I definitely want to dive into that. I am really curious about, one of the initial questions I had kind of jotted down in my notes was, what made you want to take on this position? Did you, I mean, you already kind of alluded to that. You knew what you were doing. You had this background that kind of seemed well suited, but did you anticipate the level of criticism, polemics? Did you anticipate the kind of the burden of a role like this?
No, not sufficiently. To be honest with you, Stephen, when I was doing my own due diligence, it was a whirlwind coming out of CISA. I wasn't looking to start anything. I was going to take some time off. I had 2 young kids, and I wasn't looking to start something right away. And so when the CMMC position at the AB was brought to my attention, I looked at it. Like I said, I thought, okay, I think I could help here. And I did some cursory. I want to see, is the Biden administration still going to do this, right? And okay, well, there's a rule. We've learned that's not as, that's not much of an anchor as we thought it was when there's a rule passed. And then had enough just from the reporting that that this Pentagon was likely going to continue on and in some form or another. But what I didn't do was kind of go on to Discord or Reddit and LinkedIn and just look at all the comments. And I saw some of the drama that our original board had gotten themselves into. And so I wasn't unaware of that, and I looked at that and I'm like, oh, that was unfortunate. That was probably not the best decision that those original board members might have made. But I thought, well, that's not me. And there'll be I just thought it'll be a fresh start. And I mean, how much reputational harm could have been done in just, it's still pretty much a startup. And so I was a bit surprised at the intensity of some of the sentiment out there. And not all of it was directed towards the AB. Some of it was directed to the Pentagon. Some of it, angry that this was going to be a requirement and seeing in CMMC 1.0, whether the 5 levels and the maturity practices that were put on top of 800-171. So a lot of the anxiety and maybe negative energy that was surrounding the program, it wasn't all coming to the AB. A lot of it was, but it was kind of dispersed. There were people angry at the Pentagon, people angry at the NIST, people angry at, And so, but it was
why is FedRAMP or why is FIPS one validation
Right,
still part of
exactly.
800-171? Like,
Exactly.
yeah.
And so I didn't feel like I was being singled out. I just felt like I had joined a new program that was still trying to find its sea legs, to use a Navy term. And I thought, okay, one of the things, Steve, the Navy teaches you, or taught me at least, I was on a frigate's a smaller ship, right? It's smaller than a destroyer, smaller than a cruiser aircraft. It's a small ship. Had about 120 crew members. If we had the helicopter team detachment on, it'd be another 15 to 20 guys. And you had to do a lot, right? Because there just weren't a lot of people. And so there were times when I'd have the officer of the deck in the middle of the Atlantic, and there's a storm, and you're trying to land a helicopter, and there's other ships you don't want to hit, and an engine is malfunctioning. There was just a lot of stress. And so I never thought that's probably the hardest job I'll ever have. So how hard can it be to run an accreditation body with a lot of people yelling and criticizing and all that? It was harder than I expected. It's still not as hard as the Navy experience. So it's all relative, right? If you still believe in the mission, it's like, okay, I don't offend easily. My family is generally from Irish ethnicity. There are those of Irish heritage that hold the grudge and never let it go. And then there are the type of Irish that it's kind of impossible to offend. I'm more on that side. It's kind of tough to offend me. So all the people, making cracks at me, it doesn't bother me too much.
Well, that's good. I think that's an important virtue for people in leadership to have, is to, not take criticism personally. I still agree that with more of the charitable view of things, that some of the criticism is unwarranted, at least criticism that's, and I'm not trying to puff your head up or anything like that, but like some of the criticism I just think is misinformed. And I know that's really vague for me to say, right? Because I'm not giving examples, but that's one of the things I've been wanting to ask you is, like, I guess here's the follow-up question to that. What if you knew what you knew today, and feel free to not answer this if you're not comfortable with it, but if you knew what you knew today, would you have taken the position?
Yes. Yeah. Because I've sitting here today, absolutely. It was, now if you would ask me in the middle of rulemaking, when we didn't have an ability to generate much operating revenue to kind of keep the lights on, and we had to do some austerity measures, I think I might have answered differently. But to see it through that, it was really, as you saw it, almost 3 years, right? CMMC 2.0 was announced in November 1st of 2021, and the final 48 rule just got codified in November of 2025. So 4 years. That's really 4 years, right? From now 32 CFR went through quicker, and we really were able to start operating in early 2025. So so no, today absolutely. There were some some moments during the interim period when we're wandering the desert or trying to harvest fruitless vineyards, whatever the metaphor might be. I'd probably question the decision. Yeah.
Do you agree with or do you have concerns, or do you have take issue with the fact that the accreditation body is a unfunded entity? Because I feel like that cuts both ways. Like, I can see the pros and cons, but I really see conflict of interest in some ways being almost unavoidable. That's why we have the COPC and everything. But is that something that if you had your way, that you would have wanted Congress or the DoD to fund in some way?
I think the way the program had its fits and starts, some type of initial contracting seed funding would have been helpful to get us stood up properly. And so we'd have the resources to fund the key positions. But ultimately, no, I'm very comfortable with the no cost contract. And a couple of reasons why. One, I think that's generally how accreditation bodies work, right? So you essentially there. In the United States, it's a bit differently. Most countries, there's one accreditation body in the government. But in the United States, we are a capitalist society. We have private sector accreditation bodies. NIST has one, very, very kind of specialized and focused. but you have the big ones, ANAB, A2LA, IAS out in California. Those are like the ISO or accreditation bodies. And generally, if a program, whether it's a trade association, automobile manufacturers, laboratories, when they want an accreditation body, they will hire them and say, okay, you now have the right to accredit all of our members. All the and that's how accreditation bodies generate revenue, through the fees that they apply to those that they're accrediting. Right. So there's a certain amount of freedom. Now, we still have a contract with the government that we have to perform on, and we still have regular meetings and monthly reports and all that. But it's somewhat liberating when you're not taking money from the government. And so there's less administration in terms of all the invoicing, and people in GovCon know this, all that DCAA audits. And so we're free from that. But it made it very difficult to remain viable when the program that you've been charged to accredit or authorize is not yet started. And we still had to build the ecosystem when we weren't able to generate the type of operating revenue that we really needed. So it was a challenge, but we got through it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've just been curious as to whether, and the reason I asked that was I was just curious as to whether, like, the controversy and I keep saying, the polemics in the industry, the criticism would have been different if you guys had more resources to work with. I have a strong feeling it would have been a little different. But
I think it would have been. And more to the point, I think, to your earlier question, Stephen, about kind of the reputational scar tissue, the reason why the original board, prior to my arrival and prior to almost everyone who's on my board now, but that board was in a bit of a predicament in that they didn't know what an accreditation economic model really looked like, because they didn't come from the accreditation world, right? So one of the things that I look back and kind of smile or cringe is that the original, accreditation is a very serious profession. It's dry. These are the people who are into ISO and QA and all this stuff. Yeah. And I've learned a lot being part of that. But essentially, the original board that was formed were cybersecurity businessmen who ran companies doing consulting, and so they weren't really accredited.
Engineers. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so they were like, okay, how do we make money? And some of and I don't want to go back in the history books, but some of the ideas and you touched on the conflict of interest issue, some of the ideas that they came up with in terms of how can the AB make money when the Pentagon's not going to give them anything, they didn't think through what an accreditation body does and the insulation that is required to ensure that conflicts of interest are avoided or where necessary can be mitigated. And so some of those ideas that I don't think were ever supposed to be public about how the AB could sell sponsorships and those obviously aren't going to fly in an accreditation environment. But they didn't know that back then, and it was unfortunate that they got pinned with, it was more just naivete than it was it was not corrupt or it was just they didn't quite understand how a accreditation body needed to operate.
Is there anything like related to, like you said, the reputational scar tissue or anything like that you feel like you haven't had an opportunity to dispel, or rumors that you've not had an opportunity to dispel that, maybe this is a good platform for that? Like anything that you think you could proverbially get off your chest, like for industry that still has rumors and still has misinformation, things like that?
I hope that there's not nearly as much of that as there used to be. I don't sense that there is, and I try to be as transparent as I can. And we still do the monthly town halls, and although people think we screen questions, we don't get to all the questions. But I'm open to answering pretty much everything that as long as it's not getting into any proprietary stuff that I have a fiduciary responsibility not to, about our board or anything like that. Right. But no, it's I think I'm comfortable of where we are and the policies we've implemented, whether it's the COPC, the CMMC assessment process, the CAP. Are there areas for improvement? Absolutely. We've stood up C3PO Advisory Council to help us with that. We are now standing up the Cyber Engagement Forum, or the Cyber EF, to dedicate more engagement with industry, and not just OSCs, but also GRC providers, MSPs, CSPs. The ecosystem. We talk about the ecosystem. It's the assessors and the C3POs and the RPs, but there's others, IntelliGRC included, that are critical to the success of CMMC that aren't technically in necessarily in the ecosystem if they're not part of the practitioner program. So it's a broader universe that we have to engage in. As part of the accreditation body, we can't do that, right? I have to shed some of these other duties that our contract has put on us, running a marketplace, credentialing practitioners. Those are very important functions, but not something that an accreditation body can do. So as we are presenting ourselves for our own ISO peer review here later this year, I had to create another entity to run the marketplace and to engage industry and to do more training and do more helping small businesses. That's needed. An accreditation body can't do that, so that's why the Cyber Engagement Forum, the Cyber EF that we announced at CS5 out in San Diego, is taking shape under Mike Snyder's leadership.
That's really cool to hear. I did not hear about you said the forum, the CEF?
The Cyber Engagement Forum. Yeah, it's a subsidiary to the AB, and we announced it at CS5 West out in San Diego, and it'll be run by Mike Snyder, and eventually here soon the marketplace moves under there. The RPO program will move under there, and you'll see the AB focusing solely on that accreditation mission and authorization mission.
That's awesome. That's really that's news to me. I didn't get to go to CS5 this year because of babies and everything. So yes. That's really cool to hear. All right, I want to dive into the current events. So I'm sure you've had a million conversations. I know that you're in a funky position. We talked about criticism. We talked about reputation, things like that. Right off the bat, before we dive into specifics, I think it's just important to know across the board that the Cyber AB has no control over what the CIO does. They have might have some influence for voicing opinions and things like that, but at the end of the day, it would be fully correct for you, Matt, to dispel any kind of rumors or any kind of thing that the Cyber AB had any kind of pull or had any decision. There's no reason for that to be a rumor in the first place if it was. Is that fair?
Absolutely. We were as surprised as anyone. Maybe not as surprised. I expected. Let me back up, Stephen. I will say this just to lead off, right? I've always been acutely aware and comfortable with the fact that this is not our program. This is a program that is jointly shared by the CIO of the Department of War and the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. And we are privileged to be in the position to support them in the administration and authorization and accreditation of this program's ecosystem. And so it is their program to improve. And so any CIO or any Undersecretary of Acquisitions has the prerogative to look at programs under their charge, just as I did when I was at CISA. I remember making changes to the chemical security inspection program that weren't necessarily popular. But I felt that it was my responsibility on behalf of the taxpayers to optimize everything that we were doing. And I think that's the same motivation that Ms. Davies and Mr. Duffy bring to this. That said, as I said in our statement, I was surprised and disappointed that this is kind of the way it was done for a couple of reasons. I knew that likely there was going to be, you could just hear chatter being in Washington, and I wouldn't surprise me if they would have moved the phase 2 implementation gateway that was scheduled to start this November.
Yeah, back a little bit.
Right. Yeah. Kick it down 6 months to a year, because I can cite the numbers and say we are still on a good glide path of building capacity, and that by 2028 we're going to have enough assessors to meet the full demand. And always knew that too, contracting officers had that dial of how many contracts they were going to put in, and maybe a strict constructionist view of phase 2 is that they actually didn't have the flexibility I still think they could put in self-attestation where they wanted, right? Level 2's bifurcated. So I thought they had enough flexibility, but it wouldn't surprise me if they just push that down, push it to the right. What I thought was unfortunate and somewhat inconsiderate of the existing effort was then to say, we're going to do a reform task force and look at the future of the program. Everything's on the table. Not that they can't do that. CMC has always been kind of evolving, right? There was already work being done to get us to 800-171 Rev 3.
Yeah.
So you're always kind of trying to improve the plane while it's flying, and I think CMMC was designed that. So you could have still just had a task force and look at how can we improve this. And then if you get to a point in time where you really need to do some dramatic changes, then you can announce that at the proper time. What unfortunately the messaging of 60-day task force, everything's on the table, it just sends uncertainty to the market. And I'm sympathetic to our constituents who answered the call from the Pentagon going back to 2020, made the investment, took the business risk, sent their employees or their consultants through the CCP and CCA training, non-trivial costs to take those authorized training courses and take the exams and study for the exams, and the C3Ps and the RPs who joined the ecosystem. So there's just a lot of investment that companies took on at the request, frankly, of the Pentagon to help them administer this program. I think the third-party, private sector, industry-led approach is absolutely spot on the right way to do it. Self-attestation doesn't work. We've lived that, and you're not gonna, I don't think, hire armies of DIBCAC assessors to do this with the government. That, as I say, that works for meat inspection and maybe tax audits, but not for cybersecurity, where you really need to leverage the expertise in industry, keeping track of state of the art. And so my only, I guess, disappointment was that the way it was messaged, or is being messaged, that the fate of the program is being reconsidered. And maybe it is, but I guess I would just say I think there was a way to do it without messaging that until there's going to be potentially dramatic changes. I hope that the task force, and we've been informed that we'll get a chance to participate in one of the tiers. So there's kind of a core government-only task force, and then wrapped around that, the interagency, I think the DIB, us, and some others. So I'm optimistic that we'll get a chance to show kind of the current state of the program, and also bring some ideas on how we think the program can be improved. Make no mistake, the program can be improved. There are ways to make it less expensive. There are ways to make it more efficient. And frankly, I think there's even some sentiment coming from the building that there may be other things that they want to add to it, right? OT is not part of CMMC. We're not really getting at, there's no continuous monitoring, as you know, so there's no delta assessments. It's this point in time straight up. So can we give more flexibility and create a bit of a different model? I'll be very upfront. I believe strongly in the preservation of the third-party certification to it. Obviously, you can say, well, that's easy, Travis, that's self-serving. Sure it is, but I still believe, the reason I got into this is I really believe that's the only way to ensure that the supply chain supporting the warfighters are going to be more secure than they currently are, is to have those third parties. Whether or not you need an AB, I certainly hope they still think they need an AB, but if they go to self-attestation or just do it all AI, I don't think we're there yet. I think we can incorporate AI into this model, but the C3POs themselves have a lot of great ideas on how to improve the program, and I'm optimistic that the task force will open their eyes and ears to ideas from all corners and make the best decision.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts from everything you just said. So I'm just going to give. I'm curious to hear you gauge what I'm about to say. I'm just, you would be somebody that I would really want to hear feedback for what my thought. I see two things coming out of this if I were to put money on it. And I've been saying this to some people, and maybe this will help me, clarify or whatever. But so I see the CIO coming to a lot of the same conclusions that the previous CIOs have. As a result of this review, because correct me if I'm wrong, but it wouldn't be an unfair assumption that Mrs. Davies doesn't have all the information that the previous CIOs do, and all the analysis and struggles and burdens that they've experienced that led to the logical conclusion of the CMMC program that we see today. I just have a feeling like, there's going to be a lot of similar conclusions. However, the other thing that I think is going to come out of this, and again, I'm just shooting from the dark. I'm curious what your thoughts are. I think it's very timely, or very ironic, that the timing of like all the FedRAMP changes for the consolidated rules for 2026, doing a lot of modernization efforts for their, accreditation or whatever they're going to call it. I mean, it's certification formally now, but the essentially the concept, the referent of continuous compliance or whatever it is. It just seems to me very timely that this is happening in a very close proximity to that happening, to GSA doing all that. I just have this gut feeling that they're going to come to a similar conclusion that, third-party assessments are just obviously needed, but that they're going to introduce some significant modernization efforts and maybe even tailoring to the requirements themselves that that we've had since 2016 with DFAR 7012. What is your take on that? And and on top of what I've said, your thoughts on what I've said, what do you think if you had to put, if you had to make an assumption or a guess, which I know is dangerous, but if you had to make a guess, what do you think is going to come out of this?
I do take Ms. Davies and everyone else involved that there's nothing that this is going to be a legitimate look at how to improve the program. There's no preset agenda that this is just a bread and circus or smoke and mirrors, that this is going to be a legitimate look. I absolutely believe that's the case, and that gives me encouragement. In terms of other similar activities, I think you're right. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think what you're seeing from, one, I think SBA, Small Business Administration, under this administration certainly was hearing from some small businesses. Now, what's frustrating to us in the ecosystem is a lot of the misinformation, not intentional disinformation, but just you take one anecdote of one OSC who got one price quote from one C3PO, and that's the gospel.
That's the worst of the worst.
Right. Right. And we know it's the case. We know there's been downward pressure on prices. And while I'm still not trivializing the investment to make to hire C3PO, it's clearly nothing close to the cost to actually implement level 2, 800-171. And so that's been frustrating to see some of the, whether it's on Capitol Hill or some of the other people speaking about the program not having accurate information. So we hope to bring that to the task force. We can bring the data that we have and help ensure that we're looking at, everyone's kind of looking at the current state of the program, not anecdotal evidence from 2021. But I think that what's going on in FedRAMP, obviously, is that connection to CMMC that's been awkward and we're struggling with the FedRAMP model equivalency. And then, of course, 20X, which is still not fully kosher in the CMMC eyes. And then you go from Rev 4 to Rev 5. And I think that there's been a lot of dynamic environment. Let's leave it at that. So I do think, and I wouldn't disagree if I'm not speaking or even trying to read Ms. Davies' mind, but I think if she looks at that and like, okay, I probably need a unified, I would call it conformity or compliance if you want, effort that makes more holistic sense in terms of the threats we're facing and how to make things more automated in today. And that's absolutely fine. CMMC was designed to do a very narrow thing, right? NIST came up with the standard for safeguarding CUI. The government recognized that compromise of CUI is a big problem in the defense supply chain. So we're going to make a requirement for defense contractors to meet that standard. Okay, they're not doing it and they're blowing smoke in our face in terms of attestation. So now let's have a third party. Let's utilize the accreditation community and the inspection body community and do that. So it's very simple. Here's the standard, here's the requirement, here's the validation. Now, if you want to do other things, O2 and assembly line agility and all the other dynamism, then that's adding to it. But let's not criticize CMMC for not doing other things. It was designed to be a compliance program. And when I hear, in the Pentagon press release, it's compliance bureaucracy or bureaucratic compliance. It's like, well, actually, This is
That was the
private
point.
sector. It's not in the government. It's actually I've been part of red tape at DHS. I know what that is. This is actually market. These are not government bureaucrats who are doing these assessments. You did turn to industry for efficiency and for supply demand, benefits and for innovation and
It's
agility.
logical. It was
So
logical. A
I
lot of it
hope
was
that
logical.
I think, as we said our statement, I think they'll find that those elements, those values that the current program brings indispensable, but we certainly expect there to be changes because I think, going through this and not changing anything, I don't see that being likely, and I think it'll be a missed opportunity. So I recognize, the deleterious impact that the messaging has given to industry, OSCs who think, okay, I'm off the hook. No, as Ms. Davies said, the requirement's still there. The DFARS 7012 is still there. The only thing that has been paused is the requirements for the contracting officers of when they must be compelled to put in the level 2 requirements. And what hasn't changed is everything else. DIBCAC is still assessing candidate C3POs. DCSA is still doing tier 3 background investigations and FOCI screening. The cyber AB is still operating at full tilt. The CAICO is still doing what the CAICO does in terms of classes and exams. Nothing has changed. And, again, a term that you mentioned Matt Titcom's name at the beginning of the broadcast.
My bad.
He brought a good point. It's like we should not use the term CMMC implementation because there is no such a thing. There is 800-171 implementation, and there are costs that go with that to conform to the DFARS clause. Then there is CMMC, and CMMC is not implementation. CMMC is just the validation, and there is no such thing as CMMC implementation. I think being more disciplined in terminology might help get everyone calibrated in terms of how to think about the problem.
Let me. I want to poke at that because that is a common debate within this industry. You see guys like Jacob Horn rightfully calling that out. There's no the cost that even Ms. Davies and the team, when they announced this and they were giving their reasoning, even that was misaligned to being CMMC costs and things like that. So we've had this discussion. But I wrote a blog a couple months ago that because I hear that and I totally agree. One of the things that I'm curious your thoughts on, and that I think it might be overstated that these are not CMMC costs, and the reason, and I'll give you my reasoning. There are things, and I'm genuinely wanting pushback if you agree or disagree. There are costs to CMMC beyond. My view is that there are some costs to CMMC beyond just the C3PO assessment, even the prepping for the assessment and things like that, that come with this, that were not levied under a strict DFARS 7012 reading. Okay, so for example, there are scoping elements that came with the implementation of the CMMC program, and obviously the 32 CFR Part 179.19, and which was all kind of contextualized with the assessment guides and the scoping guides that led up to the rulemaking and everything like that. So there are implementation costs that are different than if you just assumed a strict, preamble to the NIST 800-171 document that said assets, components that store, process, and transmit CUI or provide security protection. So we have these two ideas of assets that needed to have 800-171 implemented on them for. But under CMMC, we have more than that. We have contractor risk managed assets. We have specialized assets, which SCADA and operational technology and test equipment are a big part of the manufacturing base. I have a little bit of pushback, just a little bit, to the claim that there are no CMMC costs other than the assessment costs, because there's context now. We have context that we didn't have back in 2016 and 2017. Would you agree with that, or am I misunderstanding?
I think you've given a more precise summary of the costs and requirements to conform to the standard. It is not. So I wouldn't take issue with anything you've said. The scoping guide that the Pentagon came up with, it was like the last part of the document that was kind of released. And I think they took the public comment feedback in the rulemaking process to try to, to take OT off the table and kind of kick it up to level 3. But
Right.
to your point, just as we need to be very precise in how we talk about the program, I think that would extend to what you just said. So I wouldn't, not being an owner operator. I mean, we had to get our own DIBCAC level 2. We had to spend the money to get help and all of that. I would, if I did an own audit of our expenses, I'd probably find what you just described.
But to your point and to the general point, yeah, that has been a common gripe from people who just never implemented the requirements to begin with to start. That's the thing we're pushing back against is
right.
Ms. Davies, the costs that you're citing are not, it's not a CMMC problem en masse in toto. It's mostly the fact that nobody implemented their DR 7012 requirements.
Yeah. And the thing too, we talk about this is too much for small businesses, and I won't weigh into that because I can find small businesses where this is it's too hard or it's too expensive, and I can show you plenty of small businesses who already got certified voluntarily. If you look at the almost 1,800 companies that have gotten a level 2 C3PO certification to date, the overwhelming majority, and the Pentagon's got the number, I don't have the number, but I was told the overwhelming majority are small businesses who have volunteered to go ahead and get certified. Now that's probably because most of the DIB fall into some small business category, right? Just as 85% of C3POs are small businesses. I think that's a similar number for RPOs. So this really is a small business issue. So I can show you both sides to make a case that companies who, it doesn't cost them anything to say, I'm going to leave the DIB if you make me do CMMC, because they can just say that and they get quoted in a news article and they don't have to leave the DIB. They can just say that, I choose to look at the companies that recognize their obligation on the contract they sign. And going back to March of 2025, when level 2 certs were available, they went out and got them. And that number keeps growing, and it's got to find the right balance. And so I do hope that the task force takes this all into consideration and makes some good needed reform recommendations to Ms. Davies and Mr. Duffy, and let's move on and get on with it, because what markets don't like are uncertainty. And this process has injected a little bit of uncertainty into the mix. And I know that a lot of the C3POs are having some OSCs, pause themselves. Plenty are still moving forward, and that's encouraging, because I still think, and I'll say it to my last day in this role, whatever that would be, is that this is still the best insurance against False Claims Act. The Department of Justice is not going to go after a defense contractor who hired a C3PO, even if their score is wrong. Like, you have alleviated yourself, and I'm not an attorney, so it's not legal advice. But I've talked to some, you hire a C3PO and said they assessed, this is what they said I had. That's I got my cert. Even if a whistleblower says this is wasn't on the above, well, then we get involved and look at the C3PO, right? That's our problem, but it's not the OSC's problem. That's one. And two, I still think it's going to be the best calling card to go work with primes, because the primes have their own business interests to wanting trust and confidence in their supply chains. And so, if business comes to you and says, yeah, we're good, my mid-level IT manager says we meet all the requirements, 800-171, that's worth this much credibility. If a different small business goes to that prime and says, here's my level 2 certification from an authorized or accredited C3PO, that just carries a lot more weight. And
100%.
So I hope the case is obvious, but we will have to go through the process and see what the program looks like in a few months.
Yeah, I agree. That I've talked to several C3POs here recently, in the last week, and from the ones that I talked to, they have said, one guy, I won't say his name right now, he said he had like 14 assessments scheduled over the next month or so, something like that, and only a small portion, like 2 to 4 of them, even paused. They didn't even cancel. They paused just to hold up to see what happens, which makes sense. Like, if you're going to spend $50,000 on an assessment, and it turns out you don't have to, I agree with you. It's good insurance because the 32 CFR Part 170 and the 48 CFR, they're still there. They still exist. The underlying basis for that certification exists. It's like you can still go get this, but yeah, I'm hearing the same thing, that people are still moving forward, and the cancellations have been minimal, which is really encouraging. Maybe, and that's, I agree with you. That's probably partly due to the primes still having their memos out and not making any changes, but also like maybe this is actually taking hold. Maybe the concept's getting across, guys. Like, don't put yourself up to risk of getting sued by the government and taken to town.
I think the mandate's important, right? Because any new program really need that forcing function. But over time, I think this investment will just be part of the way government's doing business. And you look at the FAR CUI rule, and you can see, some agencies probably at some point opting for third-party validation of some sort. Obviously, there's the Rev 3 issue to your previous point. I think that's part of this calculus too. Is like, we got to get to Rev 3, so let's go ahead and look at that now. I know that effort had started, but there's just a lot of synchronization I think it needs to happen in the GovCon cyber compliance landscape. But I would hope that the value of this over time becomes evident. So even without it, just like we pay for a financial audit every year, and it's mostly so we can obviously maintain our tax exempt status, but also show my board of directors that we're running the cyber AB in accordance with general accounting principles and nothing shady going on. And I think that trust and confidence of having a third party assess your cybersecurity disposition gives you the same logical assurances from a board for cyber insurance underwriters. It just gives you more trust and confidence.
Yeah. I think that there's going to be a multitude of questions that come out of this, and some of these things obviously we're not going to have answers for a while, at least a couple months. Setting that aside, do you see any movement on, say, like some of the more obvious ones that had been? And I want to be cognizant of your time, but setting aside the suspension and everything, unless you had something else you wanted to add to that, do you see any movement on some of the more integral questions that we had been having? So things related to like the 20X program, or things related to, like you mentioned, the Delta assessments from like a continuous monitoring effort, because like you're right, at this point, we only have point in time assessments. There's no way to really validate continued compliance. Do you see any movement in that, or do you think we're gonna not have any clarity at least until after this 60-day review?
I think if there's a silver lining in this task force, it's now we have a vessel to inject some of these suggestions that maybe we wouldn't have had until the next round of rulemaking amendments. And so, it's the Pentagon's program. We'll authorize and accredit to it, whatever the rules are. But from what I've observed, I think there is an opportunity. One, I think the MSP, the ESP community was underserved initially, going back to the very beginning.
Yeah.
The fact that 32 CFR requires the OSC to figure out if their ESP is conducting cloud computing or not, and doesn't tell them how to do it. So as a small defense contractor going to break open this standard 145 and look at the 5 criteria and say, oh, my MSP that I hired is actually conducting cloud computing. I need to tell them to go get FedRAMP. I mean, that's just so there's some improvement in the current rule was written. And so I would like to see that. The Delta assessment is something I've certainly becoming a more open to, because to me, you don't want to stifle modernization, or you don't want to stifle enhanced security. And so if you have to synchronize your modernization cycle of your network to when your next CMMC assessment, you're on a 3-year modernization window, and that might not be good enough, because there's a disincentive potentially to go ahead and improve your MFA suite or your FIPS package or your fire, whatever it is. If you make a significant change, and again, that begs another question about but generally, as you're making big changes, you're going to have to get recertified, and the CTPO's got to come back in and do all 110. If you had a model where the CTPO could sign a 3-year deal, do the initial certification, and then whatever the battle rhythm is, continue to represent to us that they are keeping, that the OSC is remaining in a
Yeah, like
certified state.
surveillance audits or something like
Yeah,
that.
something. You would get more to, I think, the resiliency issue that Ms. Davies talks about. That the point in time tells me, even though I don't think CMMC is a check the box type of thing, I think it is holistically assessing, do you meet the standard that the Pentagon has set for its business partners. I've been through naval engineering inspections. Those are very check the box, read the gauge, you're in compliance or not. This methodology, you're talking to the OSC, right? Test, interview, demonstrate, examine, all those things. It's not a check the box, but if you're doing it just once and all the 110, controlled, all the 320 assessment objectives, and then who knows if that's still in place,
tomorrow.
Yeah. So there is probably a better way to do that. And since we've opened the door to this task force, let's use the opportunity to see if we can make the program as good as it could possibly be.
Yeah. Well, what's coming up soon for the Cyber AB, aside from obviously keeping everybody informed? I'm assuming the next town hall is going to have a lot of notes related to this. But you mentioned the forum that's going to be coming out. Is there anything else coming up for the Cyber AB that you want people to be aware of?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So Tuesday, I'm not sure when this will be airing, but Tuesday, the 28th of July, 6 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, will be our July town hall. We'll be focusing probably exclusively on this. So the recent news, we're going to try to get some OSC primes to just talk about their experience, how they do this in terms of what they're still expecting from their subs, and some ideas that they would have to improve the program. So I think that'll be well worth watching. And we still have CS5 East, which is our national conference, East Coast conference. That'll be at the Gaylord National just here across the street here at the third week of October, 16, 17 October. And then, the Cyber Engagement Forum, or Cyber EF, that is the new subsidiary organization that is going to be taking over the practitioner programs, while the RPOs, RPs, taking over the marketplace, improving the marketplace. Now, we won't have that done until towards the end of the year, but the current marketplace that we have, Steve, is really a directory. And CMMC is a global program. We haven't really touched on that, but we have international participation. I suspect we might be authorizing our first non-US C3PO by the fall. And so that's another part that has to be considered in the task force's plans of how does what we change impact the international community, because they all have the same requirements. And so we have to make sure that the marketplace, all our website is going to be available in multiple languages now. We have to really gear ourselves to helping C3POs understand what it's going to take to operate internationally. And so, it's going to be busy. Despite the requirements, phase 2 pause, it's still going to be quite a busy rest of 2026, as I'm sure it is for you and your colleagues at IntelliGRC.
Oh, boy. Yeah. And we're dealing with all sorts of stuff, not just the CMMC, but also, the consolidated rules, making decisions on what we're going to do, right? Because we're an SBA, so we don't have to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent or authorized, but we try to drink our Kool-Aid.
Sure.
That's really cool. That's really good to hear. And I guess, how are you going to be de-stressing and relaxing in the coming days, if possible?
I've got a family.
We got to hear about your routine.
I'm hoping I can still keep my family beach vacation a week down in South Carolina here in August. Otherwise, my kids will revolt.
You better take that vacation, my good man.
Hopefully I won't be asked to do any briefings during that week. So we're going to head down to the beach, and the summer is already probably halfway over now that I look at the calendar, but we have the IAAC General Assembly. So that's for the accreditation nerds, that's our regional accreditation peer group in the North and South America. So we've got that General Assembly. The ISO standard for C3POs is moving to a new version, the 2026 version. So we got to figure out how to transition that in the accreditation program. So there's a lot of dry accreditation work that we do behind the scenes that the cybersecurity community is not that interested in, but the accreditation community is still very active.
And you're saying that could be very time consuming for you. So
more so,
don't let it take your vacation. Don't let it take your vacation.
We're still growing the team here. We just will be introducing our new compliance officer, Maureen Jaguna, on Tuesday night. She just started 2 weeks ago, new communications director. And so, yeah, we're building out our team. We expect a bright future for CMMC. May look a little different than it does now, but we're very privileged to be able to support what we view as an incredibly important program, an original Trump administration program. We would love to see it continue to thrive under Trump 2.0, and we're looking forward to the future.
What do you think it's going to do in Trump 3.0? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. That's conspiracy, just a joke. Okay. Right. Matt, I really appreciate you. How can people stay in contact with you? I know it's probably really obvious, but just for anybody who may be new to hearing from you and things like that, maybe new to the ecosystem, how can people stay in contact with you?
Stephen. CyberAB.org is our website. There you can see ways if you got to send a question or support ticket. If you're interested in applying for any role in the ecosystem, you can all find it there. I mentioned the town hall, and invite us. I really appreciate, Stephen, the invitation. This is by far the most in-depth conversation I've had, and it's a nice refresher from having to talk about federal rules or firewalls or the cap. So I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's kind of you to invite me onto the program. I've watched the other episodes. It's got a great thing going here. So if you have a webinar or a conference and you're looking for the AB to participate or speak, you can just reach out to events@cyberab.org, and whether it's me or Mike Snyder or somebody else, we want to support industry that supports CMMC, and by clarifying what the rules are and where the program is, to the extent that we can. And so thank you for what you're doing, but we're excited to still be a steward of this important initiative.
Absolutely. Again, really appreciate you, Matt, and everybody, please stay in contact, stay up to date, follow everything that's going on, and
Sounds good. Thanks, Stephen.